I'm Ed Poe.
I'm Scott Rollins.
In the year 2017, most of you will remember an incident that happened in Charlottesville.
Following the horrific events, there was a forum that was called, and several people were asked to speak. But in Ed Poe's speech, he talked about how something has to be done.
Enough talk. I was going to take some action. We had to do something.
And we started talking about it, and Ed ran with the idea of forming what is now FORR.
Focus on race relations. Our organization seeks to initiate and encourage open, honest, face-to-face conversations about race and race-related issues here in Frankfort and Franklin County.
I think FORR has taken us a long way and will continue to take us a long way, and our community becoming all that we can be.
I'm Ed Poe, co-chair of the Community Remembrance Project. The project, which is in a partnership with EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, has three parts. The first component, soil collection, was completed in 2019. At that time, soil was taken from the north side of the Singing Bridge, where John Maxey and Marshall Boston were lynched in 1909 and 1894, respectively. A dedication ceremony was held for the community where soil was placed in special containers provided by EJI and sent to EJI in Montgomery, Alabama. Lynching soil from Franklin County is now on permanent display at EJI, along with lynching soil from other counties. The second component, the historic marker installation, was to be designed and installed on the north side of the Singing Bridge in 2020. The marker would be a permanent display and would give a brief history of the lynching of Mr. Marshall and Mr. Maxey. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted production, and we were forced to push back the date until the fall of 2022. The third component, the essay contest, was originally designated to be completed in tandem with the historic marker installation. But again, the COVID-19 pandemic caused us to change our plans. Here now is our co-chair to talk about the third component, the essay contest.
I'm Regina Link Swinford, and I am a member of Focus on Race Relations and am actively involved in our racial justice essay contest. We are doing this in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI for short. They began this essay contest as part of their Remembrance project. They've now separated it out, and so we're very excited to be involved in doing this year. This is an essay contest for students in grades 9 through 12 in the public schools here in Franklin County. And eventually, up to $5,000 worth of prizes will be awarded to the students who win this contest, and that will be judged by the folks at Equal Justice Initiative. So what's the topic? What we're hoping is that students will connect the dots between the history of our country and what's going on now in both our community and in our nation. So what are the topics? When you look at our website, you're going to find a wide variety of things that students can explore. And again, they can look at local history or they can look at national history and then connect the dots to what's going on in Frankfort today or in the United States today. Some examples of topics would be health and economic disparities, looking at violence, both in the past and now. Another topic might be looking at voter suppression. We have examples of that in our history here in Franklin County, and we can see how the dots continue on in the future. Believe it or not, some students may not know that Martin Luther King Jr. actually marched here in Frankfort. So perhaps you want to look at that and connect the dots of the issues he was looking at, which was public accommodation at the time. And are things still now open for everyone? That's for you to take a look at and decide. As I mentioned, the essay contest will end March 30th. At that point, the essays will be sent to the Equal Justice Initiative. They'll be deciding who the winners are, and we'll be very excited to announce them at the Juneteenth celebration here in Frankfort on June 19th, 2022. We hope that you'll participate. We're going to have teachers available at all the schools who'll be happy to help you. And we also have a contact person on our website. Please feel free to let us know if you need any help. We are excited to help you connect the dots and to learn the different things that you're going to show us about our local community and our country.
FORR has been fortunate to work with many community partners on this essay contest. The school system, Franklin County School System, Frankfort Independent School System, they have given us their blessing to go ahead and work with their teachers and their students in grades 9 through 12 to present this essay contest. Another one of our great partners that we're working with is the Kentucky Historical Society, and they have a wealth of information, resources, references, facilities that they're going to make available for our kids to do their research. Also, the Frankfort City Museum, they have just completed a renovation, and they have a brand new historic committee that's looking at the history of blacks in Frankfort. They have agreed to work with us on this project. So we want to thank them. We want to thank all the teachers and all the community members that are working on our committee to make this happen. Thank you guys so much.
In 1989, about 25% of the people executed in the United States were executed in the state of Alabama. We had dozens of people on death row who did not have legal representation. There were no institutions providing legal services to condemn people. If you don't have a right to counsel and you don't have any money and you're on death row, you're going to be executed.
It's stunning that a country that's so dedicated to incarceration as a solution for its problems knows so little about who we lock up, why, and for how long.
The people on death row had no help, had no assistance. If we didn't work on the cases, no one was going to work on the cases. In the late 80s, the Equal Justice Initiative was created as an organization to help people on death row. Over time, being exposed to a lot of other injustices in the criminal justice system led us to branch out and try to create programs and initiatives to confront the other problems outside of the death penalty context.
Imposing a sentence of life imprisonment without parole isn't a life sentence, it's a death sentence. It's a death in prison sentence. We've done a lot of work for people who've been sentenced to die in prison, people whose convictions and sentences have not been reliably imposed.
February 2nd of 2005, I gave birth at home to a stillborn son, Timothy, and then I was convicted of capital murder. And for the next 10 years, all of my 40s, I spent in the Tutwiler Women's Prison. Equal Justice Initiative believed me when no one else would. They represented me during my appeal process. The Alabama Supreme Court had my sentence overturned. My release date was December 12th of 2012. It was a wonderful day. I'm home with my children, I'm home with my family.
In the late 90s, we started challenging the way poor people are not provided adequate legal assistance. Our criminal justice system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And we think that we have to change that.
I was convicted in 2000 for drug trafficking, which was a crime that I didn't commit. They sentenced me life without parole. I got in touch with EJI. They said, we're going to work for you and we're going to get you out of here. And I cried. I just cried. because it was just overwhelming to know that somebody was actually there to help me. August the 17th of 2006, I was released, and it just was so surreal. It was just so surreal.
The young girl who was 14 years old wrote to us and said, "I've been sentenced to life without parole. Can you help me?" And that was the beginning of our project challenging life without parole as an unconstitutional sentence for children.
The United States is the only country in the world that condemns children to die in prison, some as young as 13 years of age. We've seen real progress. 8 years ago, we were executing children in the United States. And in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of children. In 2010, we were able to persuade the court to ban life imprisonment without parole for children convicted of non-homicides. And now the court has banned these mandatory death in prison sentences for all children. We started a project on race and poverty, where we're looking at the legacy of racial inequality and injustice in America. We partner with schools, other advocacy groups and organizations who are all interested in education around these issues of race and poverty.
We try to organize people to act on the injustice, speak out on these issues, and raise awareness.
It's too easy to say that something is complicated, it's difficult, it's been that way forever, and tolerate it. We can create a more just society, but it doesn't happen by itself. It is not inevitable.
For me to be sitting here, it's a miracle. I get up every day, and whatever I look at, I'm not looking at it through a chain link fence. And you can't explain that to someone.
We all begin with questions about our past, and learning the answers helps us form a more complete sense of who we are. It helps us embrace our cultures, inspires resilience, and instills compassion for the experiences of others, whether they be from the past or part of our future. Visitors have access to over 400 million records they cannot access at home. And that includes books, microfilm documents, archives, and surname files full of hidden gems in family history. You can unlock this story through standard databases like Ancestry, Fold 3, Kentucky newspapers like the Louisville Courier-Journal, and 2 centuries of the American Periodical series. But a lot of this work can be really daunting and hard to navigate. So we ensure our team is ready to help you every step of the way.
My name is Eleanor Haskin Wagner. I'm the Museum and Historic Sites Supervisor for the City of Frankfort, Kentucky. My office behind me is housed at the Capital City Museum, and we here at the Capital City Museum would love to do anything and everything in our power to help you complete your research. Now, we're not doing your research for you. Learning how to research appropriately and go through archival materials and books and first-person accounts is one of the most important life skills to help you prepare for college and beyond. It lets you discriminate between fact, fiction, and possible potential truths, and we would love to help you figure out all of those weird, murky places in between. Here at our museum, we're really blessed to have a very extensive library collection, which spans over 1,000 volumes. These volumes are dedicated to anything and everything Frankfort, Kentucky, Franklin County, you name it, we probably have a book about it. And if we don't, we're happy to figure out who does have a book about it. Additionally, we're very blessed to have a large archival collection of first-person materials. This includes not only historical accounts that were reported by people who grew up in Frankfort and Franklin County, but also newspaper articles about people's times and lives and important events here in town. We have historical ledgers that date back to the 18th century. We have books that date back to the 18th century. We're really quite lucky to have all these different materials here for you to use. We also have several artifacts that are solid objects. We have photographs, we have slides, we have film, 35mm film. We even have floppy disks, things that you probably haven't even heard of before in your life, but were used to save important data and information prior to the cloud that we all know and love today. So how might you go about completing research here? Well, I have great news. It's relatively simple, but it does require you setting up an appointment or coming in to meet with us. So the Capital City Museum is open Monday through Saturday from 10 to 4 p.m. But myself, Eleanor Haskin-Wagner, and the city historian Beth Shields are here most mornings, and we would love to set up a time to meet with you to show you the different materials that we have available for you to use. Now, Beth is a wonderful archivist, trained librarian, and a fantastic researcher in her own right. She really helped pioneer some of the research efforts at Kentucky Historical Society and the Kentucky Department of Library and Archives. And because of her hard work, our organization and collections have never been better managed. So we're very excited to be able to offer you the ease of access. And when you work with Beth, she really will be able to help you find anything and everything that you might need, including helping you figure out search terms, something that can be really difficult when you're working with a historical archival collection. Some of the beauty about working with materials and archives is that you never know what you're going to find. We might be able to tell you that we have a specific kind of material, we have documents relating to any one event or any one person, but we can't always promise you exactly what those things are. More often than not, those items aren't digitized. We have no digital record of them, other than knowing that we have them in hard form. So when you come in here to the museum, we'll set you up in our boardroom. We'll give you any and all files that you're interested in looking at. We'll have you sign a form saying that you have those files, and then you'll be able to peruse them to your heart's content. You're able to look at them as much as you want while you're here. And unfortunately, you can't take any of them with you. You can't check out books from our library, but you're more than welcome to use them while you're in our building. A big part of our dislike to loaning out records is that so many of the things that we have here are only available here. There are libraries in town at the Paul Sawyer and at Kentucky Historical Society that don't have some of the books that we have, that don't have some of the articles that we have. And a big reason for this is that the Capital City Museum has prided itself on being the place for the history of Frankfort and Franklin County. Pretty much anything that you might be looking for about Frankfort and Franklin County, I can almost guarantee you that we have. So as you're starting to work through your essays and think about the different kinds of things that you're going to be talking about, discussing, learning about, I cannot recommend enough considering how the Capital City Museum and our archives and library catalogs here might fit into your research pathos. I really, really do encourage you to give us a call or to contact either Beth Shields or myself, and we'll help you figure out if we have the resources that might best complete your research. I'm willing to bet that we do, but you'll only have to see for yourself. Good luck, and I hope everything goes well, and congratulations.
Understanding our history is crucial to understanding how we will write our future. Writing about history requires a lot of quality research. In addition to the assistance that the Kentucky Historical Society and the Capital City Museum are providing to our students, we have also curated a wealth of resources on our website, focusonracerelations.org. When you visit our site, you'll see that we've provided resource lists that are sorted by media type. Our members and affiliates are continually adding and updating this list, so you're going to find excellent resources every time you visit. Under the In Frankfort and Beyond link, you'll find a list of organizations actively working to dismantle systemic racism in our community, our state, and our nation as a whole. Each of these great organizations are their own wealth of information, so you might find it helpful to visit their sites or to reach out to them as well. Our watch list contains a list of both fiction and nonfiction films and docuseries that will expand your understanding of race and racism in America. You may find that some of these would be appropriate to screen in your classes as you help broaden your students' worldview. Our ever-growing reading list contains fiction and nonfiction books, articles, and book lists that serve as excellent resources as you and your students explore themes of race and racism in everything from our education, religion, to our justice systems. We've provided a brief synopsis of each book and article, as well as links to find the articles and the availability of the books at the Paul Sawyer Public Library. Our listening archive contains a wealth of podcasts that will inform and challenge you and your students. We've provided links to help you locate these podcasts and add them to your playlist. The final link under our Resources tab is an artistic memorial to local lynching victims. It was created by local artist and FORR member Rebecca Berry and features some of her original photography, as well as an original song that she wrote and produced. You'll also find links to other songs that will help provide important cultural and emotional context for you and your students. In addition to these incredible resource lists, FORR has curated separate resource lists specifically designed for parents and educators. These lists are designed to help you as you begin challenging conversations of your own around race and racism within your classroom. We have provided recommended reading lists for students of all ages, as well as tools to help you better evaluate the books you read and recommend to your students. Our Race and Education section is designed to provide educators and school administrators with resources to better understand how race and racism has surreptitiously been baked into the American education system, and how you can work to uproot it from your schools and classrooms. We know that talking about race with students is a daunting task. In our Teaching About Race section, you'll find the tools you need to start conversations in ways that are age appropriate for your students. The Teaching History section is specifically designed to supply history teachers with the tools and resources you'll need to help your students better understand how race has defined the American experience. We hope that you will check out these resource lists and that they will be a wonderful asset to you as you seek to root out racism from your classroom. If you're aware of any resources that we haven't listed, please feel free to send them to us, and we'd be happy to add them to our lists. Just send us an email with the resource name to info@focusonracerelations.org, and we'll be sure to include it on our site.
As we mentioned before, one of our partners is the Equal Justice Initiative. They have provided us with a lot of wonderful resources, and we want to share a few of those with you. Some of their videos are especially poignant, so we'd like to share a few of those and then also give you a sense of what those mean here locally in Franklin County.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end. It simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
After 2.5 centuries of enslavement in the United States, where black people were tortured, abused, sexually assaulted, killed, and subjected to forced labor, emancipation finally came at the end of the Civil War with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Most formerly enslaved people in the United States were remarkably willing to live peacefully with those who had held them in bondage despite the violence they had suffered and the degradation they endured. Emancipated black people put aside their enslavement and embraced education, hard work, faith, and citizenship. This period, called Reconstruction, held great hope for America and black Americans in particular. But the Reconstruction era's initial hope for progress gave way to devastating, deadly violence. Between 1865 and 1876, thousands of black women, men, and children were attacked, killed, and terrorized by white people who were shielded from arrest and prosecution. During the Memphis Massacre of 1866, white mobs indiscriminately beat, robbed, tortured, shot, raped, and killed black women, men, and children. In the course of 3 days, 90 black homes were destroyed, and all black schools and churches were burned to the ground. Black residents were stripped of their belongings and forced to flee into the woods. There was no criminal prosecution against the white instigators of the Memphis Massacre, one of hundreds of such incidents during this period. The surge of anti-black violence prompted Congress to approve the first Reconstruction Act in February 1867 to ensure that black people's equality would be reinforced. In 1868, the 14th Amendment declared all persons born in the country were citizens regardless of race and thus entitled to privileges of citizenship, due process, and equal protection. Over 80% of eligible black men registered to vote, schools for black children became a priority, and courageous black leaders overcame enormous obstacles to win elections to public office. This triggered a violent backlash from those within the white community who could not accept black equality. In Opelousas, Louisiana, in September 1868, white citizens terrorized the community to suppress black voter turnout in the upcoming election. White mobs roamed the countryside for several weeks, targeting black citizens and their white allies, murdering an estimated 200 people. Other massacres of hundreds of black people took place in New Orleans, Colfax, and parishes throughout Louisiana. Violence spread from Texas to North Carolina, where white mobs sought to intimidate and deprive black people of their rights. Despite being continuously terrorized by their former enslavers, the black community mobilized throughout the South by organizing meetings, parades, and petitions calling for the implementation of their legal and political rights, including the right to vote. In 1870, the United States ratified the 15th Amendment, explicitly prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. But still, most white people refused to accept black citizenship. In both the North and the South, there was tremendous resistance to the idea of black equality. On October 10, 1871, African-American activist and Union Army veteran Octavius Cato left the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania school where he served as a teacher and administrator and headed to the polls to cast his ballot in the city's mayoral election. Mr. Cato successfully cast his vote, but on his way home from the polls, he was assassinated by Frank Kelly, who had ties to white supremacist party leaders and who was later acquitted by an all-white jury. Being attacked or killed on an election day was a common reality for black citizens. During Reconstruction, an estimated 2,000 black men served in elected office from local and state positions all the way up to Congress. But increased political participation came at a cost of increased white violence against the black community. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, in December 1874, where black people gathered to protest the removal of their elected black sheriff from office, white mobs attacked and killed at least 50 of them. And then, in 1877, just 12 years after emancipation, the meager progress that was made towards securing equal rights for black citizens was abandoned when political compromise with Confederate holdouts resulted in the removal of the last federal troops from the South. The commitment to abolish chattel slavery was not accompanied by a commitment to equal rights or equal protection for African Americans, and the hope of Reconstruction quickly became a nightmare of unparalleled violence and oppression. It was during Reconstruction that a century-long era of racial hierarchy, lynching, white supremacy, and bigotry was established, an era from which the nation has yet to recover. 1.5 centuries after the Emancipation Declaration, racial injustice persists in America. EJI presents this report on the tragic period of Reconstruction to describe its implications for the issues we face today. We believe our nation has failed to acknowledge our history of racial terror and that we must commit to a new era of truth-telling, followed by meaningful efforts to repair and remedy the continuing legacy of racial injustice.
I'm Dantrea Hampton.
My name is Karen Armstrong Cummings.
And I'll be talking with you about voting rights. The law is a set of rules that we live by, and the Constitution is the highest law. It belongs to the United States and all Americans. Laws and rules should be followed, right? Well, there are some tricks created and used to get around rules. Our 36th president, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was put in place to ensure that registering to vote and voting was a true right for everyone. The tricks of using poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation was against the law. But can you believe that we are still fighting for our rights to vote today? In 2013, a change was made to the Voting Rights Act, which ended requirements for certain states to get federal approval before making changes to voting laws.
The year 2020 saw one of the highest voter turnouts for any election in the history of the United States. In response to this huge voter turnout, state legislatures around the country have begun enacting laws to make it harder to vote. In fact, between January and September 27th of this year, 19 states passed laws making it harder for Americans to vote.
The ability to engage and participate in our democracy is and should be a constitutional right.
I would suggest that your students and the teachers look at that question. What is the impact of the new voting laws on voting and voter access in Kentucky?
African Americans and other minorities continue fighting for their right to vote freely. Voting and your right to vote is truly your superpower. And it's my hope that you use your superpower to make changes that will benefit all United States citizens.
After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented thousands of racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. EJI has confirmed the lynchings of over 4,000 black people who were tortured, maimed, beaten, shot, hung, and burned alive by crowds of white people, often with the cooperation of law enforcement or government officials. The terror of lynching was so widespread that millions of black people fled the South and settled in the urban North and West as refugees of American terror, shaping the current demographic geography of the United States. On July 5, 1933, an older black woman named Elizabeth Lawrence reprimanded a group of white children who threw rocks at her as she walked home from work. Word spread that a black woman had dared to rebuke white children, and that night, an angry mob of white citizens lynched Ms. Lawrence for her audacity. Her home was then burned to the ground. Her son, Alexander, fled to Boston. Racial terror lynchings often had the atmosphere of carnivals, with food vendors and souvenir stands. Hundreds or thousands of white people would often gather to watch and take part in the torture and murder of black citizens. There has been no effort in America to confront this legacy of racial terror. While hundreds of Confederate monuments litter the landscape in southern states, there has been no public recognition of the violence endured by black people. On October 7, 1910, a white mob in Montgomery, Alabama tried to abduct and lynch black men being held in jail on suspicion of miscegenation, or interracial sexual relations. When they were unable to get the men out of the jail, the frustrated mob lynched a black taxi driver named John Dell, who was sitting in his cab nearby. No one was ever arrested or prosecuted for his murder. EJI's Community Remembrance Project collects soil from the many sites where terror lynchings occurred. Jars labeled with the names of murdered black citizens are on public display at EJI, a powerful visual reminder of history we must face. EJI is working to create a permanent memorial to honor victims of lynching, a place to reflect on America's history of racial violence. We hope to place historical markers at hundreds of lynching sites around the country. Contemporary issues like police violence, excessive punishment in the criminal justice system, and even harsh and punitive treatment of children of color in schools and on streets cannot be understood without a deeper examination into our history of racial violence. More truthful discourse and reflection on our history of racial injustice is essential for us to achieve racial equity. Confronting the legacy of lynching is critical to advancing this conversation. We hope you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states confront and recover from these tragic histories of racial violence through truth and reconciliation, where there can truly be equal justice for all.
My name is Reverend Leslie Whitlock, the pastor of First Corinthian Missionary Baptist Church here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And I am also a member of FORR, focused on race relations. And I'm here because of the racial injustice and all that FORR does. I'm here today to talk about the lynchings that went on here in Franklin County, Frankfort, Kentucky. Years ago, some may not realize, and some do in this city remember through their relatives, that there was some lynchings that went on here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And one comes to my mind was a Marshall Boston. who was lynched in 1894. And he, of course, like long ago, that sometime only African American had to look at a white woman, and they would say that they were getting for rape. But apparently this must have happened, and this young man, Marshall Boston, a young lady was walking home, and apparently he asked her for some money, tried to rob her, and she didn't have any, going up a Buttermilk Hill up this way, and she refused and said she didn't have any, so he proceeded, and apparently he raped her, and he let her go. After about a half hour, he said that don't look up because I will come back and kill you if you told. But she managed to tell, and they finally caught up with Mr. Boston. They arrested him and put him in jail. And during the night, instead of them waiting to give him a fair trial, militia and a big Klan group came in and overtook the security, the sheriff there, and proceeded on to lynch him on the Singing Bridge, which was one of the gruesomest murders in the state. At the time, between 1870 and 1940, over 353 lynchings occurred in Kentucky, and 300 of those were African Americans, so 72% of them were African Americans who were lynched. But later on in 1909, we had someone named John Maxey, who's also accused of committing a crime. There was a traveling show coming through the city by railway, and there's an argument started, and don't know who started what, but anyway, there was a man who was killed at the time, wounded and killed, and so they arrested John Maxey and put him in jail also. But during the night, after the officials and the judge told them to go home, and also back then one of the local priests was involved and also had told them not to bother him, leave him alone. But they, of course, apparently later on that night, they came, about 200 of them came back and broke into jail and took him also and hung him on the Singing Bridge on 2nd Street there. And not only did they lynch him there, they even shot him full of holes. Over 200 people shot him, over 100 holes was put in him, and blood was shed that night on the Singing Bridge. What the problem is that it was done without a proper trial, and a vigilante came in and took the law in their own hands. But there were others who were accused of lynching at the time. There were several that's not recorded. There was 300, but there have been more. There we have a Henry Johnson and a Henry Washington was also because there was a riot during the election. And, they were also lynched on a tree there by the 2nd Street School here in Frankfort, Kentucky. So those are some of the things that went on then, the lynching. But we come to commemorate and try to find justice to some of the family members. By myself and others, I've been seeking to find some of the relations, maybe some relatives maybe still living, so we can recognize them when we had our soil collection. And I'm still trying to do that up until today. I know that I've traced some of the John Maxey and the Marshall Boston back to up north in Maysville and Fleming County. But I'm continuing on to find out some of the history, and because I'm concerned about some of the things that were done, and also educating the youth that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. But when you have an evil, wicked heart, and your heart is not right, full of hatred, that's where it all starts. If we can get rid of the hatred and turn it into love, there won't be any more lynchings, and there'll be fairness in our judicial system, and fairness everywhere. Murder has no color, and love has no color. So I want to instill that in young people and those throughout this community, that we're here, and I want to spread all the love I can.
This is Ashley. She's 15 years old and a freshman at Robert E. Lee High School. Her school was named after, well, Robert E. Lee, the man who commanded the Army of the Confederate States of America. That army waged a brutal war against the United States, fighting to maintain a society in which Black people were enslaved and violently exploited. Today, Ashley's school provides a daily reminder of this history by honoring the men who insisted they had a right to enslave people like her. And she's not alone in this experience. The vast majority of the students at Lee High School are Black, like her. Strange as it may seem, Ashley's situation is far from unusual. In fact, there are hundreds of schools in the United States that are named after people who fought to preserve slavery and racial hierarchy. Almost all of them are public schools, and most serve student bodies that are majority non-white. How did this happen? The schools reflect not only a legacy of the Confederacy, but the more recent and long-lasting history of white resistance to racial equality. Throughout American history, Black communities have sought to educate themselves at almost all costs. Even when, during a time of enslavement, it was illegal for a Black person to learn to read and write. For most of that time, however, states and institutions have been hostile to the idea of Black education, seeking instead to reinforce a mythology of racial difference in which Black children are seen as less capable and less deserving of the same educational opportunities afforded to white children. This hostility was particularly active in the 1950s and 1960s, when Black Americans fought to integrate public schools. In 1954, when the Supreme Court outlawed school segregation in Brown versus Board of Education, many white Americans were outraged. In response, many white-dominated communities in the United States simply refused to integrate their schools. Instead, they built new, state-of-the-art schools open to white children only. To make their message especially clear, many of these schools were named after Confederate leaders who defended slavery, like Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. This was the case with Lee High, which was built and named in 1955, just 1 year after Brown, and opened as a white-only school. In many communities, this refusal continued for decades. Even though schools were no longer explicitly white-only, communities adopted many strategies to maintain de facto segregation. Naming schools after Confederate leaders was one such strategy. It was a way to signal that white Southerners would resist integration by any means necessary. And it served to reinforce racial hierarchies by referencing a terrifying and violent history. As public schools eventually began to open their doors to Black children, white students fled to private schools. Now, the majority of white children in Ashley's home city go to private schools, while many of its Black children have no choice but to attend the public schools whose names celebrate people who fought to preserve slavery and white supremacy. Truth and justice require us to confront our history honestly and commit ourselves to dismantling the legacy of racial injustice. This will require changing the names of schools that dishonor the nation's commitment to equality and justice for all.
June 12, 2020, the Jefferson Davis statue was removed from the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort, Kentucky. It was placed in the Capitol Rotunda during the Jim Crow era. How did it get there? How did it remain there for so many years? Well, after slavery, we had the Reconstruction era. During that era, Blacks made some major improvements and achievements in their lifestyle. This lasted for a little while. However, the white backlash on the Blacks making progress caused an era that we call Jim Crow era. During that era, there was lynching, there was imprisonment, there was rape, there was denial, there was all kinds of activities that the white class imposed on the Black class. And during that period, there was the construction of statues, let's say monuments, because they were so important to those in the Confederacy that they wanted to show exactly how important their leaders, their military leaders and their political leaders were to their cause. That was one reason. The other reason was that it was an intimidation act. They set these things up so that every time a black person walked by, stopped, looked, they were reminded of the era when they had no rights, when they were slaves, when white supremacy ruled. These statues, or shall we call them monuments, are all over the United States. Recently, there has been a push to take these out of important places such as capitals, public squares. It's incongruous to have a statue of someone who fought against the United States, who destroyed the principles that were expounded by the North, who wanted to keep the slaves enslaved, and who wanted to keep white supremacy the act of the nation. But that's what happened. That's history. And a lot of people, especially those who sided with the Confederacy, they don't want to see these statues come down because they say it is a part of history. Well, I agree, it is a part of history, but it's a part of history that does not belong in the Capitol Rotunda. It does not belong in a public square. They were historic, but they were not there to be honored. They were not there for admiration. They were not there so that people coming in and out had to look at them every day, day in and day out, and give homage to this individual who was the person that may have been the one who raped their great-grandmother, who lynched their great-grandfather, who stoned to death a cousin of theirs. This is history, but history has its place, and these statues do not belong in public places. And if you are a kid in civic class, somewhere during that 1st through 8th grade, you're going to take a tour to the Capitol, and you're going to take a tour and visit all of the statues that are in that Capitol Rotunda. How is that child going to feel when they see this statue of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, highlighted on a stand, giving the impression that he is to be adored, to be honored, to be reverent to our current history? How is that child supposed to feel when they're walking through that? What does the teacher say to the class when they talk about Jefferson Davis? Most of them say absolutely nothing. That's the problem. That's why these statues do not belong in the Capitol Rotunda. I think Governor Beshear said it best. He said, now every child walking into the Capitol will feel welcome. It's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction.
We hope that this webinar has helped you as you begin to prepare your students for the 2022 FORR and EJI essay contest. We hope that even if you won't be walking students through the essay contest process, that this has been helpful to you, that it has opened up a world of resources to you that you weren't even aware that were available before. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just to recap, Here's who can participate in the essay contest. Any high school student, grades 9 to 12. Students must be enrolled in one of the Franklin County or Frankfort Independent high schools. So if you have students in the Franklin County or Frankfort Independent systems, how can they get involved? Step 1 is to choose a topic. EJI is going to be providing an essay prompt that will be available on their website November 1st, and that will help guide the writing process. Be sure to visit the EJI Racial Justice Essay Contest page on or after November 1st to find the essay prompt, as well as other helpful resources geared toward helping your student identify a specific essay theme or topic. Topics may include enslavement, mass forgetting of racial injustices, inequalities in economic policy, state-sanctioned racial violence, racial terror, lynching, and violence, voter suppression, unequal access to quality education, racial health disparity, segregation in public spaces, resisting desegregation, housing discrimination and redlining, environmental racism, mass incarceration, felony disenfranchisement, the school-to-prison pipeline, the death penalty, and capital punishment. As you can see, there's going to be no shortage of topics and themes for your students to choose from. The essay prompt will be written broadly enough to allow students flexibility in working with a topic that piques their interest. Step 2 is to write the essay. Let's get specific about the details that we're looking for in each essay. How long do the essays need to be? We are looking for essays that are 800 to 1,000 words long. Essays must include a specific historical event to make connections between past and present. Essays must also include actionable insight into overcoming our history in order to change our current reality. Encourage students to imagine the world as it ought to be, then work backward to determine the changes that need to be made to make that a reality. While not required, essays may include personal reflection and can also include artistic expression. Finally, your students will need to include a list of sources and references. No specific documentation format is required, but we will require that each source and link is complete. Step 3 is to submit the essay. Let's talk about how to turn in those completed essays. Once your students have written and edited their essays, they can submit them to EJI anytime on or before March 31st, 2022. To enter the contest, the student will need to visit the EJI contest form page and complete the entry form. Once they have completed the entry form, they will receive an automated confirmation email from EJI. All we ask is that they reply to that confirmation email with a PDF or Word document version of their essay. If you have any other questions about the essay contest or about the work that FORR is doing in Frankfort or Franklin County, please don't hesitate to ask us. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you. You just need to reach out to us via our website. There's a contact form there, or you can email us at any time at info@focusonracesrelations.org. We hope that this webinar has helped you as you begin to prepare your students for the 2022 FORR and EJI essay contest. We hope that even if you won't be walking students through the essay contest process, that this has been helpful to you, that it has opened up a world of resources to you that you weren't even aware that were available before. Thank you so much for joining us today.